In the year 1350s, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio wrote in the Decameron, and this is what he wrote, I quote, I say then that the years of the fruitful incarnation of the Son of God had attained to the number of 1,348, when into the notable city of Florence, fair over every other in Italy, there came a death-dealing pestilence, which, through the operation of the heavenly bodies, or of our own iniquitous doings, was being sent down upon mankind for our correction by the just wrath of God, had some years before appeared in the parts of the East, and after having bereft Islata of an innumerable number of inhabitants, extending without cease from one place to another, had now unhappily spread to the West. End quote. Now imagine that a mere 5 days after having read this, that all of your closest friends and family have succumbed to an illness which cannot be explained. Imagine also that the residents who might live on the street have died under similar circumstances in the same amount of time. If you can imagine such a dreaded act occurring, then you may have some glimpse into the mindset of mid-14th century Europeans who were unfortunate enough to have experienced the Black Death. The Black Death itself, or what Boccaccio called this death-dealing pestilence, was a term that was coined much later in 1750. But it felt very real in the 1340s. Now, in October 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships came from Crimea and came into the harbor at Messina in Sicily. And you can see this on the map on your slide. The ships had come from the Black Sea, where the Genoese had several important trading posts, and they contained a rather strange cargo, dead or dying sailors, so showing strange black swellings about the size of an egg located in their groins or armpits. These swellings oozed blood and pus, and those who suffered did so with extreme pain. And in fact, some of the symptoms included fever, painful aching at the joints, nausea, vomiting, and headaches. Most were usually dead within a few days. The victims coughed and sweated heavily, and everything that came from their body, sweat, blood, breath, urine, and excrement, smelled foul. Now, the disease was the bubonic plague, and it came in two forms. In cases of infection of the bloodstream, boils and internal bleeding were the result. In this case, the plague spread by physical contact. Fleas infected animals or fluids, and then humans. In the pneumonic phase, the plague was spread by breathing, coughing, and sneezing. The plague was deadly. A cure was not found until the 19th century. A person could go to sleep at night feeling fine and be dead by the morning. In other instances, a doctor could catch the illness from one of his patients and die before the patient. So the writer and poet, Giovanni Boccaccio, has left us a chilling account of the plague as it struck Florence in 1348. His Decameron relates the story of 7 ladies and 3 gentlemen who leave the city for their country villa for a period of 10 days. They each take turns telling stories, 100 in all, in the garden. And many of these are bawdy, while others are full of pathos and poetical fancy. The backdrop of the first story is the plague, and here Boccaccio describes very accurately what happened, that in men and women alike there appeared at the beginning of the malady certain swellings either on the groin, or armpits. Some could be as big as an apple, other the side of an egg, and these the vulgar named plague boils. Now, rumors of a plague supposedly arising in China and spreading through India, Persia, Syria, and Egypt had reached Europe in 1346, but no one really paid any attention. And of course, there have been plagues throughout European history. Homer relates one such plague in the Iliad during the ancient times. Athens was struck in the 5th century and Arabia in the 6th and 7th century, but none was as devastating as this one. By January 1348, the plague had penetrated France by way of Marseille and North Africa by way of Tunis. And it's important to note that both Marseille and Tunis are port towns, that in fact the trade routes that had developed and ensured the prosperity, economic and cultural of Europe were precisely the ways in which the plague was able to circulate. In fact, the plague did not spread to parts of Europe that did not have such extensive trade routes, such as in isolated villages or even the Basque country. The plague then spread west to Spain and north to central France by March. By May, it entered Rome and Florence. In June, it moved to Paris, Bordeaux, Lyon, and London. Switzerland and Hungary fell prey to it in July. And in any given period, the plague accomplished its works in 3 to 6 months and then faded from view. It came and went like a tornado, its appearance and movement totally unpredictable. In northern cities, it lay dormant in winter and reappeared the following spring. In 1349, it reappeared in Paris and eventually spread to Holland, Scotland, and Ireland. In Norway, tales tell of a ghost ship that drifted ashore for months before it ran aground with its cargo of death. By the end of 1349, Sweden, Denmark, Prussia, Iceland, and Greenland fell the full effects of the plague, and then it left nearly as quickly as it had appeared. By 1350, it had completed its work across the continent in Europe. And what happened exactly? Well, in enclosed spaces like monasteries, nunneries, and prisons, the infection of one person usually meant the infection of all. Of 140 Dominican friars in Montpellier in the south of France, only one man survived. And by the middle of the 14th century, the largest cities of Europe, which were Paris, Florence, Venice, and Genoa, which were cities of populations in excess of 100,000 people, these cities saw the plague rage through, killing anywhere between 30 and 60% of those who lived there. To make matters worse, in January 1348, remember this is the month the plague first appeared on the continent, a serious earthquake hit an area between Naples and Venice. Houses and churches collapsed, villages were destroyed, and foul odors emanated from the earth, leading everyone to feel this was indeed divine retribution. The death rate from the plague was erratic and ranged from 20% to 100%. For the area extending from India to Iceland, it can be assumed that between 30 and 35% of Europe's population disappeared in the 3 years between 1347 and 1350. This meant about 20 million deaths out of an estimated population of 70 million. In fact, it was the most fatal pandemic in human history. It is estimated, because we do not have accurate records, that between 75 and 200 million people died in Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Rich or poor, young or old, fit or ill, man or woman, the plague made no distinction in choosing its victims. And it could take the entire side of one street or just one side, one house on one street. And there seemed to be no cure to these maladies. Boccaccio wrote, and I quote, "Neither counsel, physician, or virtue of medicine appeared to avail or do anything. Not only did few recover, but well nigh all died within the 3rd day of appearance from all sides." Now, it appears itself that the mere touching of clothes seemed to communicate the malady to the toucher. And indeed, in Avignon, 400 people died daily over a period of 3 months. A single graveyard received more than 11,000 corpses in 6 weeks. And in the 3 months period between 1349, 800 people died daily in Paris, 500 in Pisa, and 600 in Vienna. Now imagine the rapidity and the devastation that this must have been for all those who were lucky enough to survive and witness this. Now, accumulating Amidst death and fear of contagion, people died without being administered last Christian rites. In other words, they were buried without prayer. And this terrified everyone in an era of faith and where there was no world outside of the Christian church. And there was nothing worse than to be buried improperly. So, how did people react to the plague? How would you react to the plague? Now, of course, we would hope that everyone who remained joined together for mutual support, but the plague forced everyone to run from one another. Lawyers refused to witness wills, doctors refused to help the sick, priests did not hear confessions, parents deserted children, and wives deserted husbands. And in fact, Boccaccio wrote, "Charity was dead." So there's, in fact, an incredible range of reactions, as one would imagine. And this is what I'm going to talk about. Now, in some villages, it was reported that several villagers danced to drums and trumpets. Now, this is what will lead to what observers will call the dance of death, as represented in the slide and of the woodcut that you can see. The dance of death's representations, in fact, were made long after the plague had ended. And it did so because, of course, in the moment, recording the plague was not always what happened, especially from those who could not read or write. What happened also was that, as Boccaccio records, people lived remotely from one another. I quote, taking refuge and shutting themselves up in those houses where none were sick and where living was best. And here there was a difference between the rich and the poor. In fact, flight from infected areas was the most basic response, especially amongst those who could afford to flee. This usually meant fleeing from the city to the countryside, as did the wealthy storytellers in Boccaccio's Decameron. But things could be just as bad in the countrysides. Peasants fell dead in their homes, on the roads, in the fields, and then wheat was left unharvested, and animals, sheep, cows, goats, pigs, and chickens ran wild, or, as contemporary accounts suggest, they too fell victim to the plague. All this led to a sense of a vanishing future. And in fact, one German observer wrote that men and women wandered around as if mad and led their cattle astray because no one had any inclination to concern themselves of the future. Now, a common motif was that there was no future. And this was made worse because people did not know how the plague spreads. The carriers of the plague, rats and fleas, were very common and familiar in the 14th centuries. And fleas are not mentioned in any of the records of the plagues, and rats only incidentally. In fact, the plague, what causes the plague, the Bacillus Yersinia pestis, was not discovered until 1894. And in fact, this is also when people work out transmission. Medieval men and women were quite resourceful, however, in determining the cause of the plague. Now, contrary to what we would imagine, those who were doctors and tried to treat it, in fact, turned to medicine and not supernatural reasons. They turned to the medicine and the medical arguments they had available at the time and tried through observation and medical reasoning to come to a treatment and an understanding and even a diagnosis and cure for these, of course, to no avail. But they used medical rational arguments in order to engage with this unforeseen and seemingly mysterious death-dealing pestilence. Others reacted differently. The earthquake of 1348 was blamed for corrupting the air with foul odors, thereby precipitating the plague. Others invoked astrology. The alignments of the planets were specified as yet another cause. But for almost everyone, the plague signified the wrath of God, because a plague so sweeping and unforgiving could only be the work of some species of divine punishment upon mankind for its sins. And I say mankind deliberately. So people led processions lasting days and which were attended by 2,000 followers, according to some accounts. The people prayed, wept, pulled their hair, imploring the mercy of the Virgin Mary. Remember, cathedrals were also in. I will stop here to let my cat, Mila, pass through and have her go away. So remember, the cathedrals were also consecrated to the Virgin Mary. And the majority of people were convinced that the plague was certainly the work of God. In September 1348, the Pope agreed. In a papal edict, he specifically referred to this pestilence with which God is affecting the Christian people. So this created an enormous sense of what today people might say is collective guilt. If this was a form of divine punishment, then the sins must have been terrible. Greed, usury, worldliness, adultery, blasphemy, falsehood, heresy, luxury, irreligion, fornication, sloth, and laziness. And this really brought about Christianity as a way of understanding the world. And people looked for answers. Where did the plague come from? Why is it here? Why am I alive? For some, a scapegoat was needed and focused anger, frustration, and provided answers. First of all, of course, building on what happened before, and you can see an image in the PowerPoint, blaming this on Jews. Now, there were charges that Jews had poisoned the water with the intent to kill and destroy Christendom. Now, why do we think this is related to the plague and not to an age-old anti-Jewish sentiment that we have seen appear notably with the Crusades? Well, that's because the massacres or pogroms of European Jews began in the spring of 1348. Jews were dragged from their homes and murdered or thrown into bonfires. Homes, neighborhoods were sacked. And this fed on the historical Christian hostility and suspicion against Judaism and Jews that had been made official by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. The Inquisition stepped in, and in Savoy in September 1348, the first trial was held, putting Jewish men and women on trial. Their property was confiscated while they remained in jail. Confessions were obtained by torture, and 11 Jews were burned at the stake. In February 1349, another instance, Jews in Strasbourg, numbering 2,000, were taken to a burial ground and burned at the stake. In fact, we have many instances of these massacres around Europe took place. And when the Black Death subsided and disappeared in 1351, so too did the persecution of European Jews. So in the meantime, the massacre of Jews was exceptional in its extent and ferocity and nearly wiped out entire communities. One other movement that also involved violence, but a different kind of violence, was a rather fascinating, bizarre, and short-lived episode that was called the Flagellant movement. And you can see a representation on your slide. In 1348, processions of men who were initially well organized walked 2 by 2, chanting prayers. They passed through Austria, Hungary, Germany, Bohemia, all of Central and Eastern Europe, summoning townspeople to the marketplace. At the head of the procession was the master and his 2 lieutenants, who carried banners of purple velvet and cloth of gold. The marchers were silent, their heads and faces hidden, and their eyes were fixed on the ground before them. Word would travel ahead, and news of the procession usually brought out all the townspeople's. Church bells would ring and announce their arrival. And the marchers, once they arrived, would ring and strip to the waist and form a large circle. They marched around the perimeter of the circle, and at the order of the master would throw themselves to the ground. And then, following the ceremony, the collective flagellation took place. Each brother carried a heavy leather thong tipped with metal studs, and with this, they began to beat themselves and others. During the ceremony, each one trying to outdo the next in suffering. Now, this ceremony was repeated twice a day for 33.5 days. The flatulent movement, which finds its origin in some monastic movements that we've talked about, ascetic, devoted to self-denial, was well regulated in sternly disciplines. The new entrants, mostly laymen and clergy who hadn't yet been officially made clergy, had to make a confession of all sins since the age of 7 and flagellate themselves for 33.5 days. So the rules stated. Then they vowed never to bathe, shave, sleep in a bed, change their clothing, or converse in any way with members of the opposite sex. And they had to pay a small fee. And the payment of this fee tells us that membership to the flagellants was not for everyone. Excluded were those who could not afford to pay the fee. Therefore, this was clearly an exclusive organization that did not welcome the poor. By 1349, the flagellant movement came into conflict with the church in Rome. And the clash may have been inevitable considering what we have seen in the century before with the church's relationship to heresies. After all, the masters were claiming that they could purge sinners of their sins, something that only the church was supposed to do alone. And in fact, some German flagellants began to attack the hierarchy of the church in direct fashion. In mid-1349, Pope Clement IV issued a papal bull denouncing the flagellants as a heretical movement. They had formed unauthorized associations, indeed adopted their own uniforms, and written their own church statutes. In light of this papal declaration, some princes in France and Germany prohibited the entrance of the brotherhood to their province. Some were denounced by the clergy and arrested. And by 1350, the flagellant movement vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. It's easy to make fun of them as misguided fanatics, but let's think of the ways in which they are symptomatic of this particular moment, just as anti-Jewish violence was also sadly and tragically symptomatic. Suffering the anguish of losing your family and friends, not knowing why you had survived, people turned to religion as a way to explain and make sense of what had happened. The flagellants, blaming Jews or blaming an earthquake, was a way to provide meaning to the mystery of the Black Death. And this is the context for the rebirth, as the next period is called, that will take place and that we will discuss next week. One scholar has said that there are two ends to a pandemic. There is a biological end when the virus itself, the illness, disappears. And then there is a social end when that which characterized this moment disappears. However, it always includes unforeseen and unexpected consequences that shape the world to come.